With that, I will turn it over to our presenter, Peggy.
Hello, and thank you, Jim, for inviting me to present to the SLPs through AbleNet. Welcome to everyone that's here. Today, I want you to know that what you're going to do is you're going to learn some new strategies for fostering that collaboration and strengthening your communication. And I believe that what you learn, you'll be able to use immediately, whether you're communicating with your colleagues, parents, or any other stakeholders. You're going to be even able to use this information with personal communication, because your willingness to collaborate is going to build trust and transparency. So with that, I want you to know that what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce to you a conceptual framework that Tamara Jacobson and I created when we were writing Navigating Special Education, Building Positive Parent-Educator Partnerships. This framework we called the 5C model, and that means that we start with, in our model, conversations, moving to collaboration, cooperation, compromise, and then consensus. What I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss each attribute in depth. I'm going to tell you why it's important and how to use it. And then you hopefully will be able to bring your colleagues on board and families and be able to use this during meetings or when you're having a one-on-one conversation with parents or other team members. I know that using this model will definitely increase productivity. It's going to reduce communication breakdowns and help meetings not turn adversarial, which as an administrator and speech pathologist, I've seen too many of them do. So as you had seen, the learning outcomes are build an understanding of the core components of the 5C model, learn how to use this framework when interacting with parents and colleagues, and examine the role effective communication plays in this process. As I said, my name is Peggy Budd. I'm the author of the co-author of Navigating Special Education. And if you want to learn more about this model, another place you can do this is if you go to our website, navigatingspecialeducation.com, and that's Navigating Special Education is one word. You will be able to, there are handouts and other things on that website. I'm also a TEDx speaker. I talked about redefining the parent-teacher relationship. I'm a speech-language pathologist, an educator, a licensed school administrator, and for the past 14 years, I've been a communication consultant and trainer, customizing everything that I do. Now, the role of the speech-language pathologist. I know that most or a large percentage of you are speech-language pathologists like myself, and you probably see yourself as either a clinician or a therapist and an educator. You also see yourself as a diagnostician. You assess your students or clients, you interpret the results of how they're performing, and you use that information to drive your therapy, to write goals and objectives. Whatever you call yourself, I'm sure you've experienced communication breakdowns, as I have, or at meetings, miscommunication, where you thought you were clear, you thought everybody understood what you were saying, and you weren't. When we have communication breakdowns, what happens is sometimes it causes a lot of disagreements and meetings become more contentious. You start to argue over goals or services or programs. What I want you to think about is part of your role as a speech-language pathologist is to collaborate with your colleagues and actually, yes, collaborate with families to provide an appropriate program for your student. So I want to start with talking about frustration. And James, we have a poll that you could put up on, do you feel frustrated during meetings?
Peggy, are you able to see those results?
I'm able to see what's going on because that's good because I want to,
Great.
yeah, they're still coming. So that's great. We're still getting a few more. Are we finished or are we still waiting?
No, it looks like that's going to be about.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to close this. And frustration. Thank you so much for sharing your feelings. And as I thought, I hope all of you could see, 90% of you said that you felt frustrated sometimes at meetings. Did you realize that frustration is actually your emotional response to stress? When there's miscommunication, there's a lack of trust and transparency. You feel others aren't listening to you or considering or valuing your opinion, and so you feel frustrated. You, the professional, feels frustrated. I can almost guarantee you that at least 90% of the parents who've come to this meeting feel frustrated, whether it's you and the parent only or at some sort of a IEP meeting. I can tell you that I did some research with business professionals, whether they were business leaders or whether they were just members of a team. And 90% of those people said that they felt frustrated at meetings. I want you to think about this quote by George Bernard Shaw. The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. That's what drives our frustration. We think people understand us. We think people hear us. We think people know what's going on. And guess what? It's not always the case. And so effective meetings and reducing frustration and stress happens when we have effective communication that revolves around being authentic, being honest, and transparent. And so I'm going to provide a way to do that. It's what I call the 5C model of communication. And I'm going to first just give you a brief overview of it, and then we're going to do a deeper dive. So what is great about this model is that it has an ebb and flow. It's not that you have to do this and then this and then this. You can, as we like to believe, you must start with conversations. However, you can, when you're at collaboration, cooperation, compromise, or consensus, you can always go back to any level. And oftentimes where you really need to go back is to have deeper conversations. When we think of conversations, we think of actually 4 important criteria or attributes. Conversations must be dialogues. They must be driven by lots of questions. You have to be an active listener, and you have to understand the perspective of the people who you're talking to. When you do that, you can start to collaborate. And we believe that collaboration is not just working together, but it's working together by having developed a shared vision. And that's the way you can more appropriately develop goals. And I think when there's breakdowns in meetings and there's fights over the goals and objectives, it's often because you aren't looking at the child through a shared vision. And so that's when we're ready to collaborate. And then we can cooperate. And cooperate doesn't just mean working together. Cooperate means that we're going to support each other. We're going to use our expertise, whether it's the parent, whether it's the classroom teacher, whether it's another professional, and you're going to support them and cooperate with them. And I don't want you to think that I'm so naive that I think that there won't be bumps in the road, because there will. And like everything else, we are going to have to sometimes compromise. Well, what does compromise mean? First of all, if you're not ready to compromise, you need to have more conversations. I also want you to think about the fact that compromise does not mean that you always have to just give up something. That's what people think. All right, we're going to compromise. What am I going to say we're not going to do? Parents feel reluctant. They have all these things they want, and they're going to have to give something up. No, we're going to talk about what compromise really is. And of course, once you reach compromise, and once you come to a compromise or an agreement, you reach consensus. So before we do anything else, I want to ask you, how many of you feel that you are really comfortable speaking up when you're in these meetings, whether it's the parent or whether it's the IEP meeting or the staffing? I love watching the numbers. And I can see that there's a little bit more of a range here. But I can see that it's looking like people, do you feel comfortable speaking up at meetings? People feel comfortable, 50% say most of the time, but there's another 36% of the time people that say only sometimes, and 13% say that they always do, and only one none. So if we think about a third of the people who are on this call say that when they come to a meeting, they don't always feel comfortable. They only sometimes feel comfortable speaking up. Yet speaking up is part of being able to effectively communicate and work collaboratively and all the parts of this 5C model. So that's why there are breakdowns in communication. Are we done?
Yes.
Okay. So before we do anything, I know that you're all communication experts. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with this study, but I want you to think about the fact that what you say is driven by how you say it. Yet when you're getting ready to go to a meeting, whether it's one-on-one with a parent, whether it's an IEP meeting or a staffing meeting with a colleague, I know that you're playing out in your mind, maybe bringing notes, maybe bringing a report about what you're going to say. And my guess is that you probably don't spend much time thinking about how you're going to say it. Yet this graph represents the research of a psychologist. His name was Albert Morabian. And this 73855 is actually called the Morabian's rule. And what he found was that if your vocal tone and all the vocal aspects of presenting communication and your nonverbal communication don't send the same message as your words have very little power. They're only 7% of what you're saying, and that causes communication breakdowns. I want you to take a moment and think about what happens at a meeting. Do you, when you're at a meeting, sometimes roll your eyes? Do you sit with your arms folded? Do you not look at the person you're talking to? All of those aspects of communication will affect how that person receives what you're saying. Also, I'm just going to give you another little example. It even goes down to what words you emphasize. If you said to a parent, let me tell, I'm going to share with you something about your child, or I'm going to share something about your child. Very different tone. Parents probably going to respond differently. So I want you to think about that as we go through this model and talk about communication. As I said, the very first part of our model is conversations. What's the purpose of a conversation? It's to share information, share ideas, concerns, your point of view, your emotions. Some conversations are two-way. Some conversations are one-way. But all conversations are a pivotal part of how we communicate. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, she's telling me I have to have conversations. Well, they take a lot of time, and time, I don't have all that time. Well, let me tell you, conversations are essential, and I'm going to go through all the reasons why. And if you put the time in up front, I can guarantee you there will be less communication breakdowns, and you will more effectively communicate with all of the stakeholders, and you will be able to collaborate more effectively. I'm not sure if you're aware, but David Angel, who is a conflict consultant, developed something called 4 types of conversations. They are debate, discourse, diatribe, and dialogue. Debate is obviously a formal argument, so to speak, a formal discussion. Yet debates have winners and losers. And if you're sitting at an IEP meeting and you're debating what's going on, one group or person is going to win or lose. And we don't want that, because that causes people not to want to collaborate. A discourse, which is really what I'm doing, I'm having a one-way conversation with you. I'm discussing my thoughts and ideas. And those are great, but you want to get other people's input. You don't want an IEP meeting, just somebody having discourse. You've been at those meetings where people are doing diatribes. Diatribes are ranting and raving, and those are not very productive. What we want are dialogues, conversations between people. Of course, there's a problem. How many of you, and I want you to think hard at the most recent meetings you've attended, how many times at those meetings were you not really having conversations because you were having monologues? I know as a speech pathologist, I oftentimes delivered my monologue. I read my report. I read my goals and objectives. I just offered how much time I thought the student needed to have services. And that was it. There wasn't a conversation. We weren't having a dialogue as to what was going on. We weren't co-creating or collaborating. And so this is what I hope this model will allow us to do. So let's dig a little deeper. I talked about dialogues. They're ideal for fostering collaboration and having effective communications. Of course, dialogues are two-way conversations. And according to David Angel, he would classify them as cooperative conversations. Think about the goal. It's to talk not at people, but the goal is to talk to people, to talk with people. Let me tell you about levels of conversation. Judith Glaser, who is the author of a book called Conversational Intelligence, identified what she called 3 levels of conversation. Or how to have distinct and productive dialogues. The first is transactional, the next positional, and the highest level of dialogues is transformational. So let me explain that. Transactional dialogues, we have them all day, every day, with our family, our friends, somebody at the supermarket, when we're on the phone. They're that very simple level of asking and getting information or telling somebody something. Oh, meet me at 5 for dinner. Where's the bread aisle? What time are we going to have our next meeting? They ask the what, the where, and the when questions. You could have this conversation in an IEP meeting. You could also have this conversation with a stranger. So they're productive, but they're not going to take you to that collaborative level. So now we got positional conversations. Those are really conversations that many of us engage in professionally. And those are conversations where I give my ideas, I read my report, I share what I believe, I think, my recommendations. I tell you why, but I don't look for what you think. I don't look for what the other person has to say. I don't understand their perspective, which may be different than mine. Their experiences with the student may be different. Their testing results may be different. Their interactions as a parent may be different. So what we need to do to have productive and meaningful conversations is we have to have transformational conversations. That might be a new idea or a new term for many of you, but this is not only a dialogue, but it's where I'm going to share my position. And now I also want to know your position. What is your viewpoint? And now I'm ready to listen and understand and use that. When meetings become contentious, when there's arguments, when there's breakdowns in communication, and there's fighting didn't change anything. The goal is to change how we communicate, to change the conversation, both the type of conversation, so I'm talking about moving to dialogues, and the level of conversation. And making, what I'm saying is making sure that these conversations are in fact transactional. I said an important part of conversations is asking questions. People tell things, there's a lot of questions we have. We need to dig deeper. It's asking those deep questions. And I thought to introduce that, we'll talk about how they play out at the 3 levels of conversation. If we ask transactional questions, as I said, they're the what, the why, the when. So a statement is made and somebody might ask, well, when did you test the child? Or what is the book he's reading? Or, where does she more actively answer questions in class, in which class? Then we can have positional questions. Those are asking the what, the why and the how, and you are digging a little deeper. Again, the transactional questions, you're saying to the parent or to a colleague, what do you see as the child's biggest challenge? I've told you what I see. I want to know what you see. And then I want to know why. And then we can have a conversation about what you're seeing and how it's either the same or different than what I'm seeing. And that's going to help me collaborate. That's going to help us work together. Another example of the question is, what are you doing? What do you see working with the child, whether it's the parent or another educator? And why? Maybe what they're doing is more effective than what I'm doing. I might be working, but maybe they've got even a better answer. Asking somebody, what do you think we should change? The child is making progress, but not as much progress. Parent thinks that they want to change the placement. Maybe a teacher thinks they want to change the program. Let's have these conversations. Now we're going to have transformational conversations versus transactional. Remember, the key is to understand the other person's perspective. That's what's going to make a productive dialogue. Active listening. I did earlier webinar for AbleNet on active listening, I sent you the link on your handout. So if some of you haven't heard it, please do listen. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of active listening. Active listening means that we are not waiting for the pause in the conversation and telling somebody our idea. We're waiting for a pause in the conversation so that we're listening so we can build on what they said. We may need to summarize, ask for clarification, or paraphrase so that we can build on what they're saying and letting them know that we heard what they were saying. And so now we want to continue that conversation. One thing, if you're a good active listener, you will never say is, yes, but. When I hear someone say, yes, but, it's like they punched me in the stomach, because what does that do? It says, oh yeah, I hear what you said, but nah, we'll just throw all that away but what I have to say is more important, or but what I have to say is the right answer. That's not what you want to do. That's not going to move conversations to the next level. So I encourage you to say, yes, and that opens up the dialogue. So somebody said something, I'm adding to it. Somebody else can say, oh, and this, and this. And now we're having productive conversations. I've been doing a lot of talking about perspective taking. I'd like to know how many of you actually listen and find out what the other person's perspective is before making a recommendation. I can see that this is very split, and about a third of the people say that they always do, half say that most of the time, and some say only some of the time. And yet I'm telling you, perspective taking should be always a part of that conversation. I think we're done. And so what is perspective taking? Too often, people are afraid that if I understand your perspective, that means, oh no, I agree with you. No, that's not what perspective taking means. If I understand your perspective, I don't have to agree with you. However, I need to understand how you think, what you feel, and why, so that we can have a meaningful conversation, so that we can perhaps get to the ability to develop what we call a shared vision, or be able to reach a compromise. All of those things are important, and they come out of perspective taking. Perspective taking, as I said, is what makes the difference between transactional and positional conversations and those transformational conversations, which is what we want to have with parents and with our team. The next step in this process is collaboration. And as I just alluded to, part of collaborating comes from these deep conversations which allow us to develop a shared vision. Now, too often we come to meetings and the vision is sort of given to us. It's the school's vision or the district's vision or the clinic's vision of how we provide services for students or how we interpret information. We need to instead develop a shared vision of what we want to see for this child or this adult or this our client, and then use that to drive what we're doing, how we're building goals and objectives, how we're providing services, because now we can have these transformational conversations. Collaboration means that we're going to mutually respect each other. And then we're going to be able to work together. There's not going to be chaos because we are collaborating and we're using our shared vision to do that. So what's a shared vision? Well, yes, it's seeing things the same, but it's not necessarily like these children seeing the water at the same moment. It really means that by listening and having these transformational conversations, that a new voice will arise, that some of what I think and some of what you think will come together and we'll say, well, this is what the child really needs. And now we can really collaborate. It only happens. A shared vision only can develop when we have deep and meaningful conversations. It does open up the path to solving problems. It opens up the path to making effective decisions because shared vision leads to building goals and objectives and programs collaboratively. Let's just break down shared vision. It describes what success looks like through everybody's eyes, not just the district's eyes. Oh, that means he's succeeded. That means she's doing what we want. No, what does everybody believe this looks like? And everybody's agreed that's what success will look like. And remember, it's different for every child. That's why we write an individualized education plan. A shared vision also identifies common aspirations and common goals that we all believe that the child needs. Of course, we all have personal visions for this child or this student, and that's good too. But if we're going to work collaboratively, we have to have a shared vision. And once we are able to collaborate, we also are going to be able to cooperate. Cooperation is a little different. When we're collaborating, we are actually working together. That's what we're doing in an IEP meeting, developing the plan, developing the goals, developing the program. Cooperating means that we're going to help each other develop the goals, meet the goals, maybe even through the parents' eyes. Cooperating means that they're going to, you say, here's the drill and practice you need to help your child carry over the skills that I taught him today. That's part of cooperation. And cooperation builds on that collaboration. And not lastly, but next, I'm sorry. Next, we have to be honest. We may have to compromise. Everybody is not in total agreement. I wish that was the case, and I wish I could say it always happens, but it doesn't, and I'm a realist. So what does compromise really mean? As I said earlier, it doesn't have to mean that I have to give something up and you have to give something up so we can come to some agreement. Actually, I find that feels painful. It means that through conversations, and remember in this model, there's the ebb and flow. So if you can't come up with some compromise, maybe you need to go back and have more conversations. What it means is through those conversations, you're going to see new possibilities. You're going to say, you know what? I see a little bit of what you've said, and that will really work. And the parent says, you know what? I understand this. And if we just did a little bit of this together, we're going to come up with new possibilities, something new. And that's what I like to think a compromise is. It's something new, something that's possible. And you know what? Oftentimes when I've watched teams do this, they actually come up with an idea of the way to help the student that is better than each of them had when they came to that meeting in the first place. And isn't that what it's all about? To do what's best for the child and to develop the best program. And sometimes we need those conversations to help us think that through. Consensus. Okay. Consensus means we all agree. Well, yes, and maybe no. Consensus really empowers the team in the decision-making process. And it really means that everybody buys in. And why did they buy in? Because they felt their voice was heard, because they contributed to the conversation, because they were involved in every step of the process and they didn't feel like an outsider. They felt included and able to participate. And sometimes when a decision is made through consensus, what happens is some people say, well, I understand why we have to go this way. I understand why this has to be the best plan at this time. And I'm going to support it. I'm going to buy in. It avoids meetings turning adversarial. It avoids parents going home and calling their lawyers or writing a complaint to the state or even calling the administrator, because everybody leaves that meeting feeling that they have bought in. They have reached consensus. Let's talk about a few other ways and things that happen at meetings that aren't as great. Majority rule. I think we all grew up. Okay, let's vote. How many vote? Okay, the red team wins. The blue team, no, not you weren't the majority. Well, hey, majority rule leaves lots of people feeling they weren't included in the process. Their opinions or concerns or ideas were either minimized or actually just rejected. And with parents, they feel that oftentimes the school district, they made the decision. Well, this is the program we have. Does everybody think it's best? Yes, all the educators say yes, and the parents are sitting there. They feel that they weren't heard. They feel that their input isn't valued. And so what I want you to think about with the majority rule now is that every time we have a majority rule, we have an unhappy minority. And that unhappy minority may actually undermine or sabotage or definitely not support in that wholehearted way what the majority ruled. Go to consensus, that's not going to happen. Now, I know that in some school districts and in some clinics and in some programs, there are top-down decisions and people, no matter what conversations happen, nobody feels that they were heard because there's a leader that makes that decision. Now, I can tell you that if you go back and look at the IDEA and special education law, you'll know that that was not the intent. The intent was that everybody worked collaboratively to develop a program and that everybody felt that their voice was heard. The goal of IDEA is to reach consensus. So that concludes the 5C model of communication. And what I'd like you to do before I take some questions is let's first talk about your takeaways. So I'm going to give you about a minute to jot down what you think is a takeaway. And of course, if you have any other questions, please feel free to write those down. And then I'm going to give you what I think are 3 key takeaways from today's talk. I'll give you a minute. A minute seems like a long time. Maybe I'll give you a little less. Okay, so let me start with what I see as the first and probably a very important part of this 5C model and fostering collaboration. You have to have conversations. I've gone into all the reasons, I've gone into all the ways to have effective and productive conversations. They are the foundation to having a productive meeting. If you're having a bunch of monologues, your meeting will not necessarily be as productive, and it might be totally unproductive. Secondly, thinking about productive meetings, again, those conversations must be dialogues. If everybody gives a monologue, there are no conversations. Everybody's just telling what they think, and then you're not having a conversation. So how can you make a decision? How can you reach consensus? And lastly, conversations are your path to reaching consensus. And isn't that what the goal of this meeting is? Whether you're meeting with a parent to discuss the child's progress, you want them to understand what you're saying, but you also want to reach consensus that you're on the right track, that you both agree that this is the way we need to continue to move forward. Whether you're at a staffing and you want your colleagues to look at that, you want to have conversations so that you all agree with the best way to service the student. Same at an IEP meeting. You want to have those conversations so that the entire team, parents, administrators, educators, support staff, who's ever a part of that team, that together you have come to consensus how to best find the program, the placement, the services, the goals and objectives that this child needs. Thank you. And Jim, I think we're ready for questions.
All right, there are a number of takeaways in the chat. I didn't know if you wanted to discuss any of those specifically.
Oh, I'd love to. I mean, I can't see anything. So, or maybe I can. I guess if I go up to the chat. Oh, sure. We could go through some of these. I see, your I love this. And, you know, maybe we should just throw these out there so people who aren't looking, getting parents' perspective before making recommendations is important. A takeaway that frustration is stress exemplified, and I like that. Productive meeting does not need to end in an agreement, but should leave everyone feeling heard. Absolutely. I think those were the three that are there. Did I miss some? Are there, allowing time for dialogue, gains consensus as you go through the meeting. Don't wait until the end. Gain it step by step. Kathleen, that's an excellent point. And that's what it means to have constant conversations every step of the way, and to have that dialogue. That's excellent, and I'm glad that you reiterated that, because it's an excellent point. Active listening, yes. Okay, this is the documents. I think okay, the 5 C's, somebody asked I'm going to repeat them. The 5 C's are conversations, and they are on your handout. From conversations, we go to the ability to collaborate. And when we have collaboration, which should have created that shared vision, we're going to be able to cooperate with each other to fulfill the goals and objectives, whether they're my personal goals as the speech pathologist, or goals that we've discussed that we want to do as part of our vision. And from there, we may have a problem and have to discuss a compromise, and then we reach consensus. So those are the 5 C's. IEPs, let's see, there was another comment here. It says, I just missed that. How can, there's a question here. How can we repair a communication breakdown during a meeting or conversation? That's an excellent question. And I think that if you think about the idea of being an active listening, you see there's a communication breakdown, acknowledge it. You know, you say to if it's a parent or a colleague, let me clarify. I think that I wasn't clear enough. You misunderstood what I was saying. If you see that the parent, that there's a communication breakdown, did you misunderstand what the parent wanted? You need to always be open and honest, and these conversations must be authentic. They're not some scripted conversation that you can plan ahead of time. So that's really important. And if you do that, and if you start to find out and remember those transformational questions, that will help repair by asking, what do you think is the challenge that we need to be addressing? What kinds of changes do you think? I hear that you're, not really on board with what we're saying. Let's do a deeper dive. Again, we have to go back and have more conversations. If that didn't answer the question, please ask me again. I like another tape. Conversation doesn't have to mean giving something up. That's right. It can, but it doesn't have to. And actually, if I take some of what I had and you take some of what you had, I don't always feel like I gave up. What I feel like is I gave a rebirth and started something new. James, do you have any more questions?
There are a couple in the Q&A. The first one is appreciate any suggestions to make parents part of the intervention for follow-up practice. Some of them feel like I'm transferring my job.
Well, to make parents feel, you're asking me what are ways to make parents feel that they're part of the process? Is that what the question is?
Yes, that looks correct.
Okay, so one thing, and we write about this in our book, is sometimes before having that IEP meeting or a bigger meeting, having a pre-meeting. And a pre-meeting, you may want to have some conversations with the parents before that IEP meeting, so you really understand their perspective, or they understand your perspective, what you're recommending. They may not even understand the process, and that takes meetings as well, whether it's you, whether it's the case manager, whether it's the psychologist in different programs and school districts across the country who works with parents and how is very different. And there is no right or wrong way. If it's just in a clinic or you're the speech pathologist, having lots of meetings. I'll tell you, this model is something that's transferable into the corporate world as well as education, and in having conversations with business professionals. One colleague that I was talking to was saying to me in her company that by the time they get to a meeting, which is what they've had so many pre-meetings that everybody is really on board because they've really discussed it and understood everybody's perspective. That's having really high transformational conversations. But I would say thinking about that, understanding the parent's perspective, and it may take more than one meeting, and they don't have to be long meetings. If you only have a little bit of time, let's talk about this. Okay, well, tomorrow I hear what you're saying. Let's think about this. Here's some ideas. Why don't we can chat on the phone, we can chat in Zoom, we can talk for 5 minutes when, after you pick up your child. There's so many ways you can do this. Again, if I didn't answer your question, ask me again, because I'm not getting any visual feedback. Just have somebody say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Okay, Jim, what's the next question?
All right, the next question is, what can we do if we're supposed to come to the IEP meeting with a written IEP based on our assessment and with time recommendations for our particular therapy, i.e. speech therapy?
Okay, if you go back, that's an excellent question, and there are many school districts that expect that. And yes, but remember, the law says what you are bringing, the report is the report. Your recommendations for goals and objectives, your recommendation for service hours by law must be draft. Actually, if parents are given a copy, if that copy isn't labeled draft, we wrote about this in our book, that's not, it's illegal. You can't just come and say, this is what I want. You can come and propose and tell why, but it has to be a conversation. And if it isn't agreed upon, let's find everybody's perspective. What's going on? Why are we doing it? I'll give you a perfect example. When I was a speech language pathologist and I talked about delivering services, and I had parents who said, what do you mean you're only going to see my child a half an hour 3 times a week? They need more. And what I would then talk about, I'd say, well, let me explain to you in better detail what I do. I do a lot of work in the classroom. So I am actually modeling for the classroom teacher and for maybe the paraprofessional what is going on. So I'm the initiator of the services, but they're being carried over and reinforced, not just 5 half hours a week, but all day, every day, the teacher knows, oh, I won't accept if Charlie doesn't use a complete sentence. I won't accept if Sarah doesn't raise her hand. So I've modeled that. So that's a good way. But remember, what you bring to a meeting has got to be in draft form. That's just the law. That's not my idea. But I think it's a good way to develop collaboration. It's a good way to bring everybody on board.
All right, the next question, would this model be helpful to be taught to secondary students who are experiencing difficulty with group projects?
Absolutely. I think it's a great idea. I think that this is something that can be used at every level because they have to understand the value of having a conversation, the importance of being able to collaborate. So every aspect of this model is something that you could use in a classroom for high school students, especially those who are struggling to have effective conversations, to have them understand, again, different types of conversations, because there would be then carryover when they're having conversations with their friends or even their families. They would start to identify, oh, that was just a transactional conversation. I just needed to find out what. But if I want to find out why, I have to have a much deeper conversation. I love it. And let me know if you start using it, how it goes. And if you have any questions, on the handout, you have my email. So please send me a note. And all of you, please connect. Anybody that wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, because I write things. You can see some of the things that we're posting and some of the things we're writing about.
All right, the next question, what would you suggest when other educators or parents are not open to productive dialogue?
I'm sure that that can happen. And I think that we've got to, as with everything else, it's a step-by-step process. So start with one person who you can have that conversation with. And it's going to depend on your relationship with that person. Is it the administrator? Is it one of the two parents? But modeling that and letting them see that productive dialogues are the way that you can collaborate and will be able to provide the student with the best and most appropriate program and services. I know that sometimes parents just get frustrated and they just want what they want. It's about those conversations and it's about being authentic. This is not something that it's going to miraculously happen overnight. It takes a lot of work and a lot of modeling. And first, you have to really believe in it. You have to believe that having open and honest dialogues, being transparent, and actively listening and making sure that you take the parent's perspective or the other people's perspective and then build on that so you can reach a compromise or come up with a better way. It's an answer. Think of this as a tool and a process, but nothing is immediate, and it's definitely not a quick fix. It's got to become the way you think about doing business on a day-to-day, student by student, situation by situation.
All right, what are some good ways to rein in the conversation when someone on the team, not the parent, is dominating?
Well, I mean, I'm really, I almost pride myself in that. I think that you set the stage by saying, either we want to hear from everyone, or if you're not running the meeting and you feel that there are people who aren't, then as a participant, you can say, oh, and use their name. Mrs. Jones, what is your perspective? Or what do you see as the best program? Let's go back to that poll we just did. Everybody isn't open to speaking up at meetings. It's got to be a habit. And one of the reasons they're not open up to is because they're afraid they're going to be shut down. Somebody's going to say, oh, yes, you said that, but it's not going to work. We tried that. Do I want to open myself up to that? Maybe not. So doing that. If it's a colleague, my suggestion is if you notice that this colleague of yours never speaks up at meetings, what I'd suggest is talking to them ahead of time and saying, I know you have such great ideas. I really want you to share them. And if you don't, I'm going to ask you because remember, we talked about this and it's a good idea, building their confidence. That's and as far as parents, in our book, we have a list of what we call conversation starters, and we suggest that a case manager or somebody meets with a family before the meeting and gives them some questions that they can think about. What do you think about your child's challenges? What do you want changed? Actually they're almost all more transformational questions, but give those to the parents ahead of time and say, why don't you think about these? And there must be one thing that you want to share. Because remember, parent input is important. It's part of that IEP. And as an administrator and as a consultant, I get very frustrated when I review IEPs and in the parent input section, it says something like, I agree with what you're doing, or my child is making progress, because they're afraid to say anything. Or they can say, I don't think my child's making any progress, and that's it. And they never tell why. So everybody needs a little coaching, everybody needs a little prepping, and everybody needs to feel that there are other people at that meeting that have their back and will be supporting that they say something, whether they agree with them or not.
All right, the next question is, if all are in agreement, could that indicate an underlying issue?
If they're all in agreement,
Yes.
I don't understand the question. If everybody agrees, what's the problem?
Sabrina, are you still here? Could you possibly add to that question? While we're waiting to see, I do notice that there's an interesting conversation in the chat. Peggy, you probably don't have time to go through it all, about pre-meetings and how in a lot of districts, it's kind of uh, almost made to not be an option for a lot of SLPs. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but I thought that was interesting that that's kind of discouraged, even though that really does go against a lot of the laws that IDEA presents.
I agree. And this group is not the first group to tell me this. And I know again, we've got to have a paradigm shift. It's having, everyone, and maybe it starts with the administration, understand that some of those pre-meetings, and they're really conversations, they're not a meeting. And and when I was working, one of the things that was always made very clear is you can meet with a family. You should always be able to talk to a parent. If you're told you can't talk to a parent, how can you develop a relationship? You can't have a meeting where you have the team maybe without the administrator. That's not allowed. Or you can't make decisions, but you can have conversations with parents or with colleagues. And I know you're probably talking about to not have a pre-meeting with a parent. I prided myself in always building relationships with parents and having conversations. I was the person that said, I gave parents my phone number. I told them they could call me, and that if I wasn't available to talk, I'd tell them this isn't a good time and I would get back to them. But I always felt that if I had that open and honest conversations with parents, that I would be building trust and they would feel that I really cared about their child, and that if I made a recommendation, which I sometimes did, that they didn't agree with, they knew that I made that recommendation because I truly believed that that was what was best for their child. And I could tell you story after story where I had families who were angry about what I was recommending. Yet when we came back months or sometimes even a year later, they would tell me, I understand what you recommended and why, and you know what, you were right, but I didn't want it because. So I'm telling you, have those conversations, talk to people in your district. I hope they don't tell you it's illegal to have a conversation. You can have a parent conference at any time. So I hope that answers the question.
All right, and I've got a bit more clarification on that last question. uh, some might agree because they're not prepared or they don't feel free to express themselves, or they're intimidated by the group's setting to speak freely. So I think that's really getting at the heart of the question. If all are in agreement, could that indicate an underlying issue that maybe people aren't comfortable?
Yes, and I think I addressed that along the way, and you're absolutely right. People, I mean, I, as an administrator, sometimes had parents come back and then hire an attorney. And when we would come back, they would say, well, I didn't really agree with what you said. And my response as the administrator would be, okay, we can move forward from today. But what happened in the past, the record reflects that you agreed with what we were recommending. So I think it's important to let everyone know that their opinion matters, that we're going to consider it, and that they need to speak up because this is about the education of the child. And let's go back to that shared vision. If everybody develops that shared vision, you're not there, then they are going to all be in agreement legitimately. So when you feel that people don't speak up because they're afraid to speak up, don't know what to say, those are all breakdowns in communication. That's why it's important to make sure that we give parents, these are some questions you should ask. These are, give them a list, meet with them ahead of time. I have done some consulting for a school district, and I encourage the special ed teacher to meet with every parent for at least 10 minutes prior to the annual review, to give them a list of question starters, to tell them that their voice matters and that it is important for them to speak up, and then everybody has to show respect. And it's a cultural thing, and it's going to take time. This is best practice. This is a good way to move it. You may have to take baby steps, thinking about the things that you're saying. You don't want everybody to say yes and walk out of the meeting and find out that parents are angry or one of your colleagues is angry. That's not solving anything. So having those conversations is important, and doing them up front. Too often, those conversations start to occur after somebody has filed a complaint or somebody's going to due process. Let's have them so we don't have to file a complaint, so we don't go to due process, that everyone feels that the goal is to reach consensus and do what is best for the child or for the student or for the client, whatever, at whatever age they are and how you're referring to them. Sabrina, does that clarify the question?
She did say thank you. So I would assume that that does clarify the question.
Good.
And that looks like that's all of the questions that we have.
Well, this has been great. I know that my contact information, if you want to reach out to me, feel free to. Please go out to Navigating Special Education, because you will see other documents and outlines about this model and other things related to the IEP process that may help you have more effective and meaningful conversations. Thank you, James, for inviting me to talk to everyone today. I think it's been great. I really enjoyed it. I hope you have as well.
Peggy, thank you so much. The comments in the chat are very positive. Thanks again for sharing your model and your knowledge and expertise with us.
Thank you. How do I save the chat?
I can send that to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
For everyone that's still here, if you'd like to earn ASHA CEUs for today's presentation, please remember to complete the assessment. That link has been posted in the chat, and I will post it one more time before we close out. You will need to complete that assessment at 80% or better, and it will be open for 1 week. So you have 1 week to complete the assessment. Of course, I recommend getting it done as soon as possible. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.